Growing up, I lived only about 30 minutes from my grandparents' farm, so it was a regular thing that we would go and visit them on the weekends and the holidays. I remember playing with a handful of ducks and goats that they had, running around in the small grove of trees behind the house, and exploring all the intriguing differences between the farm and my mundane city life. Back then, the idea of their farm was more akin to a magical land that I was lucky enough to visit. Vast and lush and full of animals that seemed exotic and exciting. But the counterpoint to this sense of childish wonder and joy were my young fears about the large field that lay behind my grandparents' farm and the house next door. Most years it was planted in corn and sunflowers, the rows of tall stalks and reaching leaves resembling an invading army of monsters, waiting impatiently at the border of my grandparents' land. And presiding over that terrible horde was the Scarecrow. An old shirt and overalls stuffed with straw and topped with a torn potato sack head and a worn straw hat. My father told me that it was to keep the birds away, and that he wasn't a real man and he couldn't hurt anybody. But I would always check and make sure the Scarecrow hadn't moved from its high perch among the crops when we were coming or going from my grandparents' house. Even as a teenager, when I thought I was well past being scared of corn and stuffed shirts, I would find myself glancing out into that field to make sure that the Scarecrow wasn't off its post and marauding between the fields. It was an ingrained habit that I found myself repeating 2 months ago when I pulled up to the farm again for the first time in 3 years. My grandfather died when I was 21, and my grandmother had followed him just a week before my arrival back at the farm. She had managed to outlive my grandfather and both of my parents, but she had to leave the farm for nursing home care during the last years of her life, and I hadn't returned to the house since she had left it. Still, it was in good repair. She had someone look after the place and they had done a good job overall. And that's when I realized that I was unconsciously checking for the Scarecrow. There was none, but there were no crops either. The old man who had owned it for decades had died the same year as my grandfather, and whoever owned it now, they kept to themselves and they didn't seem too keen on farming. Weeds and grass grew tall as my chest throughout the 20-acre strip, and in the middle of it, the old wooden post that had held the Scarecrow was faded with age and bare. Shaking my head, I had gotten out and I started checking the house more thoroughly for problems. If all of this had happened a year ago, I would have said I was going to do minimal repairs and then immediately sell the place for the best price that I could get. I had sentimental attachment to the farm, but my career and my life were over 5 hours away, and that didn't involve raising ducks or planting a garden. I was only a few years out of school, but I had a good high-paying job at an architecture firm, and I had no intention of going anywhere else. But things have changed. In the past 6 months, the firm has been dissolved due to an embezzlement scandal between the partners, and I have been forced to live off my meager savings and a handful of short-term contract jobs. With my ever-looming student debt and no real prospects, I decided that I would give up my apartment and come to stay at the farm for the next few months. The contract work I could do from pretty much anywhere as long as I had internet, and it would give me some financial relief while I figured out where I was going to land. I was prepared to find the house in terrible condition. Even well cared for empty houses have a remarkable ability to fall apart, as though the lack of people inside caused them to age prematurely. But aside from some bad plumbing and a hot water heater on its last legs, I wasn't in bad shape at all, which was more than I could say for the house next door. Much like the weedy field, the house had developed into a ramshackle eyesore. Over the next few days, I would find my eye drawn to it. A voice in the back of my head whispering that the new neighbor was probably going to take about 30 grand off my asking price when I got ready to sell the place. Still, there was nothing to be done about it, and for the time being, I was enjoying being back to a place filled with so many good memories. I even got into the habit of taking walks every morning and sitting on their wide front porch as evening would come, taking in the beautiful scenery and the blissful silence. But still, my eyes would wander back to my neighbor's house on occasion, a constant irritant in the corner of my eye. I never saw the owner, and as far as I could tell, His old red pickup truck never moved from its spot in the front yard. Nothing ever changed at all, until I saw a new Scarecrow in the field between us. It was larger, and even at a distance I could tell it was better constructed and defined. It had a weight and substance to the way its body hung on the post. Its hands were fully formed and covered with dark gloves, as opposed to the tied-off sleeves and jutting hay straw of its predecessor. And several things struck me about the Scarecrow as I studied it from the porch. First, I didn't understand what the point was. There was no sign of a field itself being tended or cleaned up in any way, much less anything being planted. Second, it seemed so odd that it looked so well made when there was such an obvious lack of attention to everything else over there. Third, it being better made and more substantial somehow made it more off-putting than the old version had been, perhaps because it more closely resembled an actual man. Finally, whatever the reasons, even at 32, I thought it was creepy as hell. Over the next few days, I was busy with several new contract projects, and that combined with the finicky internet and working on the plumbing had me preoccupied most of the time. But I still found myself thinking about the new Scarecrow frequently, and every time I went outside, I found myself checking to see if it was still in its spot. I kind of hated that little surge of relief I would feel when I saw that he was, and over the next several days, I came to realize I'd started to think of the Scarecrow in terms of he rather than it. I was irritated with myself for being spooked by an inanimate object, but that didn't stop me from peeking over there, just in case. And then one night, he was gone. I pushed down the initial flush of panic that I felt, telling myself that the owner had either taken him, it, down or it had fallen down on its own. I was in the middle of finishing up a draft for a client, but I forced myself to sit down in one of the porch chairs and hang out for a few minutes. I knew that it was only to prove to myself that I wasn't scared, but I didn't care. If I was going to be out here by myself for the next few months, I had to get over being unnerved by every little thing. And so I sat, looking around and trying to empty my mind, but really just waiting for the next time my roving gaze made its way back over that field and that empty post. When I first saw movement in the grass near the post, I froze, my mouth going dry as I suggested to myself that it might be a trick of the fading twilight. When it happened a second time, my rational self declared that it was either a critter or the man had decided to put the Scarecrow back on its perch. When I watched the Scarecrow climb back up on its wooden post and settle there, all thought fled from me. I was rooted there by fear and some low-level instinct to stay still, to not be seen. I knew it was no trick of the light. I had watched that thing climb back up on the post under its own power. It was alive somehow. And that's when it turned its head and it looked at me. Even across the distance, I could feel its gaze hot on my face. And after a moment of boiling horror, I bolted inside. When I looked out through the window, I saw that it had already turned back to contemplate the field, and my logic started to reassert itself from behind the safety of window panes and locked doors. Clearly it was a costume. There was a person wearing a Scarecrow costume for whatever bizarre reason, and I had seen them getting back up on their post. There was probably a little platform lower on the post that they stood on, and they were playing a practical joke on me, or making a movie, or just being weird. It didn't really matter because a person was the only thing that made sense. And besides, they were on their own property, I reasoned. Whatever odd or silly shit they wanted to get up to over there, well, that was their business. The main things were that it wasn't a monster and they were over there, not over here. I repeated these points to myself throughout the night and the next couple of days, and while the continued presence of the Scarecrow, the person dressed as a Scarecrow, I would correct myself, was creepy and weird, he hadn't moved again that I had seen. It still preoccupied my thoughts, and I realized that I had abandoned going for my morning walks or hanging out on the porch in the evening, but I tried not to dwell on it more than I could help. So by the third night after the Scarecrow looked at me, I had resigned myself to watching TV and eating a microwave lasagna while studiously not looking out of the windows. Until I did, and I saw the Scarecrow at the window looking in at me. Its face was partially obscured by a dark, wide-brimmed hat, but what I could see looked to be made of a swarthy, oiled leather. There was a leering slash of a smile stitched up with some kind of thick red thread, and above that twin silver buttons shaped like long, sickle moons stared in at me, dancing in the reflective light and motion from the television. The rest of the thing's face was riddled with black marks of some kind, similar to Norse runes but different. As I watched, the sack skin bulged slightly in spots as its smile turned up at the ends. I took this all in during the brief 2-second window of shock and surprise before I lost my shit. And then the yelling and pedaling out of my chair and away from the window like the house was on fire. I grabbed up my phone and I locked myself in the bedroom that I'd been using, moving to pull the curtain on the room's window as I called 911. Over half an hour later, a sleeping-looking deputy pulled up and took my statement before going over to talk to my neighbor. When he came back, he looked much less sleepy, but I could tell by his expression that he didn't have good news. "Look, I talked to your neighbor. He's a weird fella, no doubt about that one, but he says that he doesn't know anything about it. He told me that he put up a Scarecrow about a few days ago, but it hadn't moved from that spot since. We were standing on the porch now, and he gestured to a shadowy shape over the field. As you can see, it's up there now." I gritted my teeth. "It took you over half an hour to get out here. He had plenty of time to put the Scarecrow back up there after taking off the outfit." I realized my mistake as his gaze hardened. "Listen, bud, we have 4 deputies to cover nearly 600 square miles, and you live far out. You'll have to forgive us if you have to wait a few minutes." He puffed out a breath, and when he spoke next, his voice was softer. "Look, I knew your grandparents. They were good people. I'm sure you are too. But country life is a bit different. Try not to spook yourself so easily, okay? See, it could have been just you falling asleep and having a dream. Or maybe the guy next door was playing a prank. Call us again if you need anything, of course. But sometimes you just have to let things go or handle them yourself." With that, he patted me on the shoulder and he headed back to his patrol car. I wanted to feel angry or offended at being brushed off, but I knew that he was probably right. I either needed to ignore it or try dealing with it myself. When I woke up the next morning and still felt scared and angry, I decided I was better off just to go talk to the neighbor. I'd be nice about it, but maybe if I let him know I took it serious, it wouldn't happen again. It didn't work out that way. The neighbor's house was in even worse shape up close, and I felt my stomach roll slightly as I started getting various whiffs of decay as I made my way up to his front door. I saw the source of it, at least some of them. There were 2 dead birds and a dead possum, littered across his yard in various stages of decomposition. Swallowing down my rising vomit, I focused on the door and I knocked. The man who came to the door was likely only a few years older than me, but he had the worn-out, prematurely aged look of a junkie. He was short and balding, with sallow skin that hung loose on his dirty frame, and that was barely covered by a soiled wife beater and a discolored pair of underwear. A fresh bouquet of stale sweat and beard struck me when he first opened the door, and when he spoke, the smell of decay grew stronger as well. "What do you want?" His voice was low and gravelly, with an accent that I couldn't place. His red-rimmed eyes were full of contempt as he waited for me to respond, and I could tell by the way he was holding the door. He was on the verge of shutting it back in my face. I swallowed again and I began. Well, I just wanted to let you know that I wasn't trying to hassle you last night by calling the deputy. I really did have someone at my window wearing a mask that looked like your Scarecrow." He let out a dry, cawing laugh. "It wasn't a mask. It was the Scarecrow, I reckon." I frowned. Well, yeah, I guess. I mean, I saw some guy in the full costume climb up on that post the other day. Are y'all making a movie or? He was shaking his head, his teeth pulled back in an ugly smile as he continued to chuckle. You're not getting it, mate. It's not a costume. It's the Scarecrow. I wanted to immediately discount him as crazy, but the thing was, he didn't seem crazy. Hostile and condescending, yes, but not crazy. I found myself taking a couple of steps back from him. That's impossible. He shrugged. Maybe so, but it's the truth. That there thing comes from the rot, and there's a whole lot of impossible that can come from such as that. I blinked. What the hell was he talking about? Maybe he was crazy after all, or into some odd religion or something. The rot? I don't know what you're talking about. He laughed again and he waggled a yellow finger at me. Of course you don't, sheep. But maybe you'll find out. I felt a new surge of anger. Is that some kind of threat? Look, if you or your Scarecrow come back on my property, your ass is going to have a problem. His laughter cut off as his eyes grew dangerous. You need to mind yourself talking to me, boy. And I have no interest in you. As for the Scarecrow... He paused and looked out into the field. And for a moment, I saw fear pass across his face. I can't control that thing. I thought I could, but it's too strong. He looked back at me, his expression of hard arrogance returning. So you best be watching out for yourself, because it seems it's taken a liking to you. I got little accomplished the rest of the day, and when I went to bed that night, I felt for sure that I would never get to sleep. I hadn't fired a gun since my early 20s, but I had my grandfather's shotgun loaded in the bed next to me as I stared up at the ceiling. I found myself jumping at every creak and groan of the old house, and every few seconds I was glancing out of the window, despite the fact that I looked out into the backyard and not towards the field. The last thing I remember was patting the stock of the shotgun for the 20th time to make sure that it was still close by, and then I was waking up. The Scarecrow was standing over me. It was nearly a full moon that night, and while the room was still dark, I could see well enough to watch as it leaned down towards me. Letting out a yell, I tried to scramble away off the other side of the bed, but it was too fast. One hard, gloved hand pressed down on my chest with enough pressure to hurt, and pinned me to the spot while the other hand pulled back the sheets and began pressing on my stomach. The pain from my chest was overtaken by a thudding ache that spread across my abdomen as its fingers probed. And while my mind was lost in the tumult of blind animal struggle and fear at the time, later it occurred to me that it was almost as if he was looking for something or examining me. And then, just as swift as it had begun, it was over. The Scarecrow had jerked his hand away from my stomach as though it had fallen on a hot stove, and with a last warning push on my chest to stay down, it moved quickly from the room. A moment later, I heard the front door slam open and the creak of the front porch as the thing left. I stayed deathly still for several moments, and when I finally did move, it was only to rub my chest and stomach. I wanted to call for help, but I knew that there was no help to be had, and I feared going outside of my car in the dark. So I crawled off the bed and over to the door to lock it, and once that was done, I pulled the forgotten shotgun free from its tangle of sheets and held it tightly as I sat in the corner of the room and waited for sunrise. The light was still returning to the world when I heard the first sirens. First closer by, and then farther away, and then closer by again. I was curious, but I was also still petrified. Whatever was going on out there, I planned to wait until things were quiet and then bolt from my car and never come back. So when somebody began to knock at the bedroom door, I let out a scream. 3 seconds later, the same deputy from before was busting in the door, eyes wide and gun raised. His gaze found me in the corner and he raised his other hand. "Put the gun down." I dropped it immediately and he lowered his own slightly as he looked around the room. Are you alright? Are you alone in here? I nodded, unembarrassed tears springing up to my eyes. Yeah, I am. Unless that thing came back. His eyes went to mine and I could tell something had changed. When he didn't respond, I went on. What happened? I heard sirens and I didn't call anybody this time. He sighed and he sewed his gun back on his belt. Bad things. The worst I've ever seen, I think. The guy next door. His house burned down. The fire crew has him mostly out now, but from what I've seen, he's dead. Not from the fire, but from his guts being ripped out. I started to respond, but he wasn't finished. We were getting the call about a fire when another call came in. A couple of miles further down the road, a young woman and her 9-year-old son were murdered. The father found them when they came home from the late shift. They were hollowed out too. The deputy's eyes had lowered to the floor as he had been talking, but now they lifted past me to stare out of the window, at the backyard and the grove of trees beyond. I don't know what happened, but I think I believe you a lot more now than I did the other night. I doubt you had anything to do with any of the rest, but you'll still have to be examined and questioned, of course. He looked back at me. My advice is to leave off trying to convince anybody that there's a living scarecrow prowling the woods. Meeting my eyes meaningfully, he went on. In fact, my report is going to say that I woke you up during a welfare check and you were surprised that anything had happened. How does that sound to you? I nodded, my throat painfully dry and tight. Yeah, but why help me? He shrugged. Because I meant what I said the other night. I figured that you're a good kid in a bad place, and I've lived long enough to know there's enough bad already in the world without me making more. Or maybe because I should have done more sooner, and I saw some things tonight that made me realize that. Either way, go ahead and get dressed and we'll try to get you done quickly. I wanted to ask what else he had seen, but looking at his haunted expression, I thought better of it. So wiping at my tears, I just nodded and started thinking of what I would say. I haven't returned to my grandparents' farm since that day, and I don't plan on that changing in the future. A week after the murders, the deputy called to tell me that the sheriff's office had concluded their initial investigation, and I was no longer considered a person of interest. And although they had no suspect yet, they were going to continue to investigate until they did. I could hear in his voice how he expected that to go. And while I'm not going back there myself, someday I'll put the farm on the market for a very cheap price and hope that somebody snaps it up, severing my last ties with that place and those memories forever. But for now, my mind is on other things. Because tomorrow I'm going into surgery for a partial colectomy, the removal of parts of my colon. I started having stomach pains and bleeding last month, and when I got it checked, the doctors figured out that I have stage 2 colon cancer. Treatable and with a good likelihood that I'll recover, even if I always live in the shadow of the cancer coming back down the line. But a month ago, when I was sitting in the doctor's office as he gave me the news, his face full of practiced concern and his words no doubt a canned resignation of standard disclaimers and assurances, I barely heard any of it. All I could think about was the scarecrow jerking its hands back and forth as it explored my abdomen, almost as if it had discovered something unsuitable about the guts coiled inside. The doctor jumped slightly when I let out a snort of relief laughter at the thought. Not only had the colon cancer possibly saved my life, but it made me doubt the scarecrow would ever try to find me again. I was damaged goods, I guess. And cancer sucked, but at least I could understand it, try and fight it. And compared to facing that rotted thing, that horror that was still roaming the dark somewhere with its silver moon eyes and blood red smile, I have to say, I like my odds.